This is authentic. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you enjoyed episode 1 with Paco about how we got to the F-16. Today, we're talking with Air Force veteran Mike Hilts Hilton, an F-16, among other platform pilots. Welcome to the show, Hilts.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's great to have you here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Hilts, how you got to the Air Force, your background flying in the Air Force, and what you're doing now?
So, I went to the Air Force Academy and then straight to pilot training. Got an F-16 out of pilot training. Went to replacement training unit at MacDill and flew the A model for a couple of tours, Torrejon, Homestead, Kunsan. Then I spent a tour in the F-117, and I finished up with 2 more tours in the F-16, the Block 30 and 40, and then my last assignment my second to last assignment was in the Block 50.
Okay, nice. And you retired, and now you're still flying a little bit for the government, right?
Yeah, I've been doing a couple of government contracts. So right now I'm flying a Challenger 650 in Eastern Europe, and before that I flew Dash 8s for about almost 5 years.
All right, very cool. Well, we're really happy to have you on the show. And what we're talking about today is the first episode in the early block F-16s. And if we're going to discuss that for the listener, Hilts, let's talk about first, what is a block in an Air Force aircraft?
Well, I think it's so let's start out with the models, right? Everybody's familiar that there's A model, B model, C model, D model. So the early F-16As were, improved upon when they got to the C. So the B and the D are the 2-seat versions of those. And then within the A model and then eventually the C model, there's different iterations. So sort of like improvements as you go. And when enough improvements were put together, they would label that a block. So, for instance, the very first airplane was the Block 1, then it went to the Block 5, and then the 10, and the 15. There was a bunch of sub-blocks underneath 15. And then when they moved to the C model, that's where we started to see the blocks 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Okay.
So they're just incremental improvements within the specific model.
Okay. And so we started with Block 1, went to Block 5, 10. You said, at least for the F-16, or maybe in general, is it a 5-count cadence there in the blocks generally?
It tends to be in the F-16 anyway. It was a 5 to 10 number increase. I'm not really sure what the logic was behind it, but I imagine that if a bigger jump in number is more improvements.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we're here primarily to talk about the F-16A, the early models. What makes the F-16A? I guess this is the base of the whole aircraft, so to speak. This is where it started.
Right, and so I'm sure Paco talked about the lightweight fighter program. So the A models were truly the lightweight. I mean, there was a lot of room in some of the avionics bays where they had future plans, but there wasn't anything in there. So the early A models were lighter airplanes. The avionics were crude by today's standards, but they were state of the art at the time. But the biggest, I think, advantage of that airplane was just how nimble it was. And it was also pretty good on fuel. So it had decent legs, but it was also extremely maneuverable and versatile because, we were dropping bombs and air-to-air and the whole 9 yards.
Right. So, as we sort of discussed in the first episode of how we got here, things that sort of come full circle out of World War II, right? By the end of the war, we've got fighters that are fighter bombers, and they're more efficient than dedicated attack planes. And, we go through that circle of the, we'll call it early mid-Cold War, where everything's getting specialized. And we come out of Vietnam with the F-4 Phantom probably being the premier aircraft in the Western world, definitely. And it's doing it all, but it really wasn't designed that way in the first place. So now we've got the F-16, which was designed to be that, right? It's the ultimate dogfighter and an attack air. Well, I don't want to say an attack aircraft, but
I think the original genesis was for a day VFR only fighter.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. Yeah.
And then of course things started evolving because at the time, so this is kind of the peak of the Cold War, mid 80s to mid 90s, or basically early to mid 80s, where everything had to be capable of carrying a nuke. So, I mean, at one point in time, we were sitting nuclear alert in F-100s,
Right.
right? So now, if you're going to build a new airplane, it's got to be able to carry a nuke. So, if you're going to carry a nuke, you need all that weapons delivery capability. And then we go, well, we can put conventional bombs on this thing as well.
Hmm.
And I think that's kind of how it evolved. And then we figured out that the platform itself was pretty stable and was a pretty good bomb dropper as well.
Okay. And let's dig into that a little bit, right? So it's both maneuverable and stable. Uh,
Mhm.
why is that, and what did that mean for you as a pilot?
So, maneuverable because the aircraft is statically unstable, has a fly by wire computer system that basically keeps the airplane with the pointy end going forward,
Hmm.
which is what you're generally looking for. But it also created a lot of stability with it. So, the thing that was different about the F 16 was that in most conventional aircraft, when you move the stick, you command a displacement of the flight controls,
Hmm.
and that dictates your roll rate, your nose rate, all that kind of stuff. In the F-16, when you push or pull on the stick, so if you're going to roll, you're commanding a roll rate, not a displacement of the controls. The computer figures out how much displacement to give you for how much pressure you're putting on there. That gives you a roll rate. Okay, so if you push left on the stick, you're asking for a roll rate to the left. Let's say it's 30 degrees per second. If you release the pressure on the stick, the airplane stops.
Hmm.
That's where you've probably heard the term roll ratchet from some early F-16 guys, because in a conventional airplane, you start the roll, you back off a little bit to establish that roll position, and then you go back the other way. Well, in the F-16, you go roll, and if you take off the pressure, it just stops right
Hmm.
there. Now, for pitch, normally, again, we're displacing controls to make the nose go up and down. In the F-16, you're basically commanding a G load.
Hmm.
Okay, so whatever the energy state you have on the airplane, you pull back on the stick, and it says, "Oh, well, that much pressure equals 6 Gs, so I'm going to give you 6 Gs if you have the energy available to do that."
Right.
The thing that was different about the F-16's maneuver curve is that most airplanes have a corner velocity. My best turn is at this speed,
Right.
and a lot of them are in the 400s range. I think the F4 was like 420 or 440.
Hmm.
The F-16 had a corner window.
Interesting. Okay.
So your best turn was if you were between 330 knots indicated and 440 knots indicated, you got your best turn. At 440, that would be 9 Gs, and at 330, it's about 7.2.
Okay.
But you get the same nose rate at either one.
Hmm. Okay. So let me unpack some of that for the novice listener a little bit. Right. The unstable aircraft means prior to the advent of computer control, airplanes were, if designed correctly, were generically stable. So the way you're driving your car down the road, if everything's balanced and tuned correctly, if you take your hands off the wheel, it should keep going in the same direction, and
Mm-hmm.
that's inherent stability. Now the F-16 had that dynamic stability you're talking about, which means the computer was continuing to give the micro inputs, right, to keep you going the way you wanted to go.
Mm-hmm.
And what that
But
go ahead.
it also means that so you got the computer telling keep the airplane pointing in forward, going where you want it to go, but it wants to move.
Right.
So all the computer's doing is letting the dog off the leash. When you want to do something, the computer says okay, and it goes.
Right. And so, momentum being a thing, and for me as an ex ship driver, right, when you're moving through the water in a ship, which is obviously a much thicker medium, it takes power, it takes time, it takes effort to get the hull moving in the water. Whereas the F-16's already, it's almost just standing on the balls of its feet already, if you will.
That's a really good
Yeah.
analogy. Yeah, it's spring loaded to go do something
Do
different than what
something.
it's doing right
Right.
now. Yeah.
And then, as you said, instead of trying to steer through, because I like to use car analogies for people because I think, most people drive and they get it. Uh, you're not necessarily turning the wheel, in this case, moving the stick to get a specified angular offset of your front wheels. You're just telling the car, I want to move left. I want to roll, or in the plane, I want to roll this much. So, as you said, that gives you a lot of ability to just make really rapid and precise maneuvering.
Yeah, it's a very quick airplane. It's some airplanes you fly, you displace the controls, you kind of wait a potato, and the airplane kind of starts doing its
Right.
thing. In the F-16, it was nearly instant.
Okay. And then you were talking about the cornering window, which is, let's just anchor on that for a minute. If people aren't familiar with the corner, right? And you described it really nicely, where there's a point for a given speed that if you pull a given G, you get your best turn rate, correct? Not necessarily radius, but rate. How quickly are you
Yep.
going around the circle? So,
Yep.
and I happened to, just from talking to somebody else, I think the F-14 was about 350 knots, and they had to hold, I think, 7 degrees nose down, and I think it was like 6.5 to 7G, and you're going to get your best. That's a lot to keep, you know, in your mind, and obviously you get the feel for it, and through training, but that's a lot to sort of keep maintaining in the middle of a dogfight, right? Because you're also looking for the other guy and planning your next move and moving ahead. And so you've got this window, and you can maintain any speed within that window, and keep your max turn rate, which is a huge advantage, right?
It's a super duper advantage
Yeah.
because your energy state, um, you know, you can be at any energy state within that window and still have your best turn available to
Mm-hmm.
you, as opposed to, you get 30, 40 knots slow in a Tomcat or an F4, you don't have your best turn now.
Right.
And trying to get that energy back, especially in those airplanes, took a bit of an effort.
Right. And so I've talked with people in other series about learning BFM and how it's sort of a chess game of thinking 3 or 4 moves ahead. This gives you a huge window, as you said, of options to drive the other guy to where he's weakest, right?
That's correct.
Like
Yep.
you don't, if you're fighting an F-18, he excels at the slow fight, so you want to keep your energies up, right? And you want to keep that a high speed turning fight. Whereas that Tomcat might fight better slow, or might fight better in that mid range, and if you can get slow on him and make him bleed his energy, you've got an advantage.
Right. So that it gave you more options against other
Right.
platforms.
Okay. Now we talked about the stick input giving not direct control surface input, but in effect the throttles, though, were they direct control, or were you telling the aircraft something similar?
So you're still feeding a computer. You're
Mm-hmm.
feeding inputs to a computer. So in the A models, early on we had the Pratt and Whitney 200s, and it had an electronic engine control.
Mm-hmm.
So that meant that you could do anything you wanted with the throttle, and you weren't going to get a compressor stall.
Okay.
You weren't going to screw up the engine. But you could push that thing all the way forward, and the electronic engine control would figure out what you wanted, and it would provide that to you with the engine. Those improved in later models, especially in the C's and D's, where that became a digital control. This was still analog. So the flight control system in the F-16A model was analog.
Mm-hmm.
So was the engine control.
Okay. But still, as we've talked about, it's a quantum leap over everything else that's flying, especially at that time.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's probably important. I can think back and I remember, I don't know if it's one of the YF prototypes, but the red, white, and blue F-16, right? One of those prototype aircraft. So we're talking the mid 70s, and you're talking about, the Navy still has some. Is just phasing out the F-8 Crusader. The F-4 is still the mainline fighter. There's still Phantoms in the Air Force. I don't know if there were still F-100s in inventory by mid-70s.
No, but there were A7s.
That's right, there were A7s. So this really was a huge quantum leap. So with that, let's talk about in the cockpit. What did that mean for you? A lot of pluses. Excuse me. A lot of pluses. Some minuses, though, right, from that original design as well.
Well, I think the big plus, the thing that you first notice when you get in the airplane, is that when you sit in most other fighters of the era, you're kind of sitting a little bit low in the cockpit. You got mirrors all over the place. In the F-16, when you sat in that thing, the canopy rail was kind of right at your hip.
Mm-hmm.
and you're sitting in that big bubble canopy, and there were no mirrors in that cockpit, but you could look over your right shoulder and see your left wingtip
Wow.
because the visibility was spectacular. So that was probably the thing that you noticed the most when you first got in it. And the other thing was the sort of the advent of the true hands-on throttle and stick, the HOTAS.
Right.
So for the most part, when you were flying, you didn't have to take your hands off of either one of those controls unless you were trying to pull your body around. We had, in order to be able to maneuver your shoulders so that you could look, across to see that other wingtip, we had these, we call them towel racks, but they were basically handholds on each side. So you could reach over with your right hand or your left hand and pull yourself to the right to be able to look behind you or over that other side. So the visibility and then the hands-on throttle and stick, those were I think the really ergonomically the things that were a big advantage. So yeah, visibility and control.
Right.
The disadvantage was some of the switches were pretty small.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had to wear winter gloves or chem gear or anything like that, especially the switches on the HUD were almost impossible to manipulate with any sort of precision. And the getting to some of the avionics were in blind spots. So the blindfold cockpit check became a real thing.
Yeah.
And then a lot of the stuff like entering all of your navigation data and your bombing data and all that stuff was done with the left hand, and it was down where you really couldn't see it very well. So that was a little bit of a disadvantage. But once you had the airplane set up, you really didn't have to go anywhere but outside.
Nice. Okay. And that's again a big change, right? Because we've heard from other people on other shows about earlier platforms, and you're going in the middle of a fight down inside the cockpit because you got to change something, and that's first of all lose the fight, right? Mm-hmm. And then just transitioning in and out. Anyone who's driven on the freeway, well, I guess in this day and age we see a lot of problems on the freeway because people seem to be paying more attention to their handheld device or their whatever their dash is telling them in the road, and we see where that gets you. So the early birds, you and I had talked when we were sort of discussing how this would flow out, that this was a little tail. I think I may be using the term wrong, but
no. So we call them small tails.
Small tail.
So the first iteration I flew, the block we had a couple of block 10s left when I got to the replacement training unit, MacDill, but mostly we were flying the early block F-15 or that block 15, and those had the stabulator surface area was smaller, and it made it super nimble, but it also was easier to put out of control. So the F-16 doesn't really stall like a conventional airplane. Essentially what happens is you can put the airplane into a position where the flight control computer can't figure out what to do with it anymore, and you end up what they call a deep stall or a departure. That you can get out of it, but you have to override some stuff in the flight controls. It's it's an emergency procedure essentially. Okay. So we were taught not to assault the limiters was the term that was used.
Yeah.
So if you assaulted 2 or 3 limiters, you had a pretty reasonable chance of going out of control. And as an example, in my RTU class during the BFM phase, we put 3 of them out of control.
Okay.
Which was, the leadership wasn't real happy about that. All 3 recovered. And then about that time, we started getting the big tails. So the big tail was a little less maneuverable, not much, but it was also much more difficult to put out of control.
Okay.
It could still be done, but it was a lot harder to do.
Fair enough. And so stabilator's the horizontal, all moving tail.
Yes.
Yeah, rear control surface, essentially. Okay.
Yep.
So, and you mentioned something that hadn't even occurred to me, which is when you're doing this computer-controlled input, that means, as you said, when you're out of control, you've pushed the computer beyond its limits, right? And so, as you said, you sort of have to deactivate some systems or override.
Well, the recovery procedure for that was, and hopefully your engine didn't compressor stall at the same time, but typically you would have an engine issue as well. And so now the airplane is in a position where it doesn't have enough air going over the tail, and the nose gets hung up, and it's rotating almost like a spin, and the nose is oscillating, but you're not controlling it.
Right.
So there was a switch. It was a guarded switch. It was called the Master Pitch Override Switch, MPO.
Mm-hmm.
And what that did was that gave you, and I don't remember the exact number, but it gave you significantly more nose down capability. It would basically override the computer and allow you to displace that stabilator even more in the nose down position.
Okay.
And so what the goal was, so the nose is oscillating, it's up and down, and you're rotating. What you're trying to do is create bigger oscillations so that you can get the nose to drop down and get it pointed at the ground. Now you got air going over the surfaces. Right. You can let go of the MPO switch, and now you're flying the plane again.
Okay. So when you say that override, NPO or MPO?
MPO, Mike Papa Oscar.
Okay, so you're not just pressing it and letting it go. You're holding on to it while you're doing this.
Yeah, and you're hoping that you're not under negative G while you're doing that. To try to, So yeah, you reach down, you hold that master pitch override, and then we used to call it, you try to rock it out of the deep stall.
Yeah.
So you're trying to make the oscillations bigger, so eventually that nose will drop down into what we call the recovery cone. So if you get it to drop down and get more air going over the tail, now you're back in control of the airplane.
Right, because a stall is lack of airflow over the control surfaces in the wings, and you need to get that back somehow.
Right, so it's not a stall in the conventional sense. You're seeing the airspeed oscillate between like 50 and 150,
okay,
but it's not consistent. And because you got this big yaw moment going on, the flight control computer can't figure out, what's going on with your angle of attack, what's going on with your yaw rate, all that kind of goes, I'm out.
Okay.
So now you got to put it back into an area where it knows what it's doing again.
Okay. So you basically have a switch that's this MPO switch that tells the computer, hey, the pilot, the human in the loop, understands what's going on and is telling you, let me do these things to fix it.
Yes.
So, it's funny you brought this up. I did an earlier project on flight training and with a Navy pilot who was a test pilot, and during test pilot school in an F-16, he just mentioned, we're talking about worst case scenarios. He's like, well, this one point I'm upside down in an F-16 and it's sort of doing a flat spin, but not really, because now the nose is oscillating. And now you've just explained to me exactly what Sunshine was his name. Listeners of the show will know. And so explain what happened. It was interesting to hear all that you just described, because he wasn't a high time F-16 guy, right? He's going to school to learn it, and he went through his procedures and had to hand it over to the instructor pilot in test pilot school. To get out of it.
So when they put the big tails on, it was much more difficult to put it out of control. And they would take guys out to Edwards. I just lost you.
I'm still here audio-wise. I think my camera just had a...
So they would take guys out to Edwards, especially, test pilot candidates and stuff like that, and they would put them in a B model, and they would severely adjust the CG to get it so that they could put it out of control, and then do the recovery. But I have talked to a few guys that went out to that class, and even with the wacky CGs and wacky configuration, they still couldn't get it to depart.
Couldn't make it happen.
So so it's that the big tail made a huge difference, and the frequency at which guys put airplanes out of control tapered way off after that.
Yeah, and I mean, computers are, they're faster than humans. There's a whole philosophical conversation on computers and AI right now, but, I liken it to when we would do missile shoots, and telemetry missiles are supposed to be an offset aim point, right? They're supposed to pass within a couple feet of the target drone, so you save the target drone. And it was very hard sometimes shooting off an Aegis to not get a skin-to-skin kill and destroy the drone, because the computer just wants so much to essentially follow its programming.
Yep. So, it does become problematic when you try to get it to not do what it's supposed to do.
Right. So, and speaking of missiles, let's just do a brief rundown, because, we talked about with Paco about how we got here. Let's do a brief rundown of what the F-16 had in terms of armament and combat capability.
So air to air, let's start with that because that's the easiest, right?
Yep.
So you had a 20 millimeter gun, and it carried 500 and I want to say it's 510 rounds. And you could carry different types of rounds, high explosive incendiary, training rounds, stuff like that. You could put tracers in it, that sort of thing. So we would carry a full gun. We had, as far as missiles go, all we had were AIM-9s. So and in early days, we had Limas, AIM-9Ls, but we also had a huge inventory of the Papa version.
Okay.
So typically for combat, they would load you out with one of each.
Okay.
So the Papa was definitely, that was a rear aspect only missile. You couldn't shoot that head on.
Right.
The Lima you could shoot head on, and then eventually we got the AIM-9 Mike, which was an even better all aspect heater. But we did not have AMRAMs. We didn't have AIM-7s. We didn't have anything like that. So basically, you were heaters and guns.
Right. And that was yeah. Go ahead.
And then we had chaff and flare as well. And then for air to ground, we could basically this is pre laser guided bombs for the F-16. So the laser guided bombs existed, but we didn't have a laser on the airplane at this time. That didn't come in until the Lantern pods came online a few years later. So all of our bombs were dumb bombs. But we had the computer on board the airplane had a significant capability, and you could get a really good bomb very consistently. So we had a couple of different delivery modes. One was the constant computing impact point, which we called the death dot. So you had this little circle in the HUD, and it would range off the ground. So it's constantly computing the ballistics of whatever ordnance you have loaded. And when you mash the button, it would freeze the dot, and basically the bomb would go right through the dot.
Nice.
And then we also had a dive toss capability, which was a little box you could slew around in your HUD, and you could lock that on the ground, and then it would give you a line in your HUD, and you would fly the line until your flight path marker hit the release cue, and then the bomb would come off. So the computer's figuring out the ballistics of what you're doing.
Right. So you're almost underhand tossing the bomb at that point.
Right. And then we also had a loft capability. So this was primarily for nukes, where you'd sling your bomb about 3 miles from low altitude. So you drive in at 540 knots at about 300 to 500 feet. And it would basically give you a cue, and it would tell you to pull. So you would start to pull, hold down the pickle button. When it hit the release cue, the bomb would come off.
Right. Now,
and the other one was...
Go ahead.
The other mode was LAD, low altitude. Can't remember what it stood for, but it was basically for dropping retarded weapons from low altitude. Okay. So sort of the same profile, but the computer, the math would drive you in closer because it would account for the retarding agent on the weapon, whether that's a chute or a balut or fins or whatever it was.
Right. Those bombs, such as the Snake Eye in Vietnam, I think they called them, where they were retarded, so they didn't drop slower, but they dropped behind the aircraft more rapidly, or more drag.
And there were some nuclear delivery methods where you wanted that chute to come out. So most of the stuff we did were long range loft.
Okay, and to your point, I'll borrow and probably badly paraphrase an Israeli comment. I think 1981 was when they used the F-16s to bomb the reactor, the nuclear reactor in Iraq, Operation Opera. I think it was the reactor in Osirak out of Baghdad, and they used F-16s with iron bombs, and they said they're smart bombs and they're smart planes. You only need one of the two. You don't need both.
That's about right. Yeah.
So
we had iron bombs, and of course we could drop CBU, we could drop any of the Mark 80 series family of weapons, and we had Gator mines and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. But our bread and butter was Mark 84s, Mark 82s. Those were the main ones.
Right. And so at that point, did you even have the capability for something like a Maverick that might have? Okay.
Yeah. So we did have Maverick. Not every unit trained to them. I think I did some training on the Maverick. I mean, we did it in the sim a lot, but yeah, we did have the capability for Maverick. And it sort of depended on your unit's mission. So if you were a CAS unit
Right.
than they did a lot of Maverick.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So, and we're going to talk later, either later in this episode, or we'll do a follow-on episode right after this about avionics. And I don't want to delve too much into that right now, but we'll discuss the HUD and sort of the limitations of the HUD. But with everything you've described so far, and I bring up the HUD because it was pretty basic, as you've told me in its initial iteration. The early F-16s, it sounds to me, and tell me if I'm wrong, were the sort of ultimate expression of that of the pure fighter, right? Going back to even like a P-51, right? With great visibility and great speed and great maneuverability, and it can fight air to air and it can do air to ground. This was the ultimate development of that concept in its early phase. Now it's gone on to be even bigger and better things, but this is visual range, amazing maneuverability, amazing speed, right? Is this just sort of that fighter pilot's dream from the 50s and 60s?
Yeah, I would say so. And the one thing that the F-16 got more complicated as the blocks progressed and the models progressed, but those early A models were you could almost consider them minimalist. So there wasn't anything extraneous in there. It was head up, hands on, and then go out and see the guy and kill him.
Right.
So that obviously has changed over time because now there's a lot of BVR stuff going on with AMRAAMs, and the radar's more sophisticated. So those and of course now they're carrying targeting pods and
right.
Armed targeting systems and all kinds of crazy stuff. But yeah, back in that early era of the F-16, it was pretty minimalist.
Okay. All right. Well, then we talked about the weapons. We've talked about the flight characteristics of the early birds. Let's talk about the engines on the early blocks.
So the early blocks, we eventually got two engine manufacturers, but it started out with a Pratt & Whitney 200, right? And it was a good engine. It was a staged afterburner, kind of like the Tomcat, where you basically had 5 stages of afterburner. But it was really simple to operate. It was pretty simple to start. It was decent on fuel. And it was a turbofan, which was kind of new too, right? Because everything prior to that, J79s and previous were all turbojets. So they tended to be smoky. They tended to be fuel hogs. They tended to be more prone to compressor stalls, where now we're into a turbofan it's a low bypass turbofan. But it was the spool up time was a little bit longer, I would think, than the turbojet, but you had an enormous amount of thrust and pretty decent fuel economy, if you will, if you consider 10,000 pounds an hour fuel economy.
Right.
So no, it was the only time I ever had any problems with the engine was doing functional check flights, where they put a new engine in, you go out and you run it through its paces, and you might get a stall or a stagnation doing that kind of activity. But operationally, flying and training, I never had one single compressor stall on that engine.
Wow. Okay, so
it was pretty reliable.
Yeah. So turbofan, turbojet, for the listeners who don't know, and I'm going to take the layman stab at this, and then Hilts, you can correct me. A turbojet is what laymen probably think of as a jet engine, right? It compresses air at the front, and you see the fan blades, and the compressed air then gets fuel injected and then ignited, and you get thrust out the back. A turbofan has a much larger compressor fan section at the front, and as an example, the next time you're at the airport waiting to board your airplane, you look out the window and you look at how enormous those nacelles are on a commercial jet aircraft. But then when you get on the plane, if you're sitting behind the wing and you can see, or you look at one of the other planes, the actual exhaust is a lot smaller diameter. Well, that's because you've got those large fans, right? And it's actually causing more air to go around the combustion chamber than through the combustion chamber. Am I on track so far?
That's all correct. Yeah, and you're actually getting thrust from that first stage.
Right.
Where in a turbojet, all the thrust is coming out the back end.
Right.
So yeah, it's definitely more efficient. There are a few drawbacks. Like I said, the engine doesn't spool up quite as quickly.
Right.
Uh, but those, the F4's problem was smoke,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if they came to the merge, they wanted to be at least in minimum afterburner, so they weren't smoking.
Right.
Uh,
Because
we
the enemy
had
can
that
see you way further away than you can see him.
right. So the other advantage that the turbofan had was it cooled down more quickly.
Okay.
So if you came to the merge against an air-to-air heat-seeking missile threat, oftentimes when we got within range, we just go to idle,
Mm-hmm.
and the engine would cool down, and it prevented that front aspect heater shot
Nice.
To a degree. So yeah, there was some. I think the advantages outweigh the disadvantages when you talk about turbofans versus turbojets.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't think off the top of my head of the last plane we've designed with a turbojet. I know as always, a listener will weigh in incorrect if I'm wrong, and I always welcome that. But the A6 and the EA6B, I think in the Navy, were the last ones I can think about
Right.
that
So
were
the Air Force,
turbojets.
probably the F4 and the F111 were still turbojets.
Okay. Yeah. And then spool up time is that time between the throttle input being made by the pilot and that taking effect and giving you resultant thrust, right?
Yeah. So especially if you're at a lower power setting and you need a higher power setting quickly, it takes a little bit longer for that to manifest in a turbofan. It's not a huge amount of time, but it can seem like a huge amount of time
Right.
if you really need.
Right. As a Navy guy, of course, even as a surface Navy guy, knowing the history, that was an issue with early carrier aviation, right? You're trying to make corrections on the ball and how fast or how slowly those jets spooled up. And even recently, without delving into the whole issue, I'll just use it as an example. If you watch the video of the F-35 incident on the Vinson and you listen to the commentary about it, they talk about the pilot adding power and the engine spooling up. And I'm not saying spool up time contributed to that, but it's an illustration of why you need an engine to spool up quickly. Because when you need it, you need it.
And when we moved later into the digital engine controls and the C models, the spool up time definitely was reduced. So some of that's the computer doing that. The other thing that was kind of odd moving from a turbojet, so I've been flying T-38s and training and all that, and then you move into the F-16, now you're in this turbofan, and when you're flying formation in a turbojet, when you move the throttles, you get the thrust.
Mm-hmm.
In the turbofan with the computer, you move the throttle, the fan moves, and then the computer trims the engine.
Okay.
So you can end up chasing your tail a lot with small power settings. So had to kind of anticipate what the computer was going to do to the engine,
right?
So that when you displaced the throttle, you ended up with the power setting that you wanted.
What you wanted when you wanted.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there was some anticipation involved. Another slight disadvantage, but again, it's something that you can get used to pretty quickly.
Right. Now, the intake on the F-16, obviously down below, has that very characteristic single intake for the single engine down below. And I'm sure in later episodes, there'll be discussion of the later blocks, but there's something called big mouth and small mouth on F-16s, right?
Yeah. Yep. So actually, that term didn't even start until the Block 30.
Okay.
Which was in C models, right? So when they started putting GE F-100s in the C models, the first Block 30s had what we call the small mouth.
Mm-hmm.
So it reduced the volume of air that the engine could consume.
Okay.
At any given rate. So all the A models had small mouths.
Okay.
So that wasn't even a thing, but you definitely noticed the difference in a Block 30 between a small mouth and a big mouth. And the big mouth, especially in military power and below, you had significantly more thrust than you ever did in a small mouth.
Okay. Interesting. But of course, you're flying the early blocks. There's nothing to compare it to, so it's not.
That's right.
Not an advantage or a disadvantage at that point.
Yeah, there was really through the A models, there was really no change in the configuration of the intake nor the engines.
Okay, awesome. So we talked a little bit about that cockpit and how high up you are in that bubble and the visibility it gave you. But let's look at the overall ergonomics of the cockpit.
So the cockpit was, I just got to sit in a Eurofighter about 2 weeks ago
Okay.
because the French guys were out here, and it was similar to sitting in an F-16.
Mhm.
So it's basically like putting on a glove.
Okay.
So you kind of slide yourself down in there. The seat's tilted back 30 degrees, which can help with your G tolerance. But the big thing that I felt was great was that you had the throttles on the right, so it's a side stick, and you had an armrest, okay,
Mhm.
so that your elbow wasn't constantly getting
The,
pulled down to the
the
panel every time you pulled G's.
sticks on the right, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
And then the throttle was basically shaped for your hand. So it wasn't
Okay.
just some knob that somebody put in there. It actually felt like a grip,
Hmm.
and it was easy to get to the switches. So I think switch wise, it was pretty good. The things that weren't great were having to change radio frequencies or change a nav aid frequency because, again, that's on a panel that's down here. And you kind of got to the point where you could do it without looking at it. But so that was a little bit problematic. The visibility, like I said, was fantastic, and air refueling was easy, even though the receptacle is behind the cockpit.
Hmm.
So you just kind of learn to taxi up under the tanker and use visual references to get plugged. Um, the the airplane was pretty easy to land consistently well. So ergonomically, it was set up well for that, and we flew an angle of attack on final as opposed to specific airspeed. We would calculate the airspeed that
Hmm.
we would need, but we were really paying attention to the angle of attack because that thing will, if you get it down near the runway and you exceed that angle of attack, now you're scraping speed brakes and,
Hmm.
fins and all kinds of stuff. And that did happen a few times. Um, but the airplane wasn't hard to fly.
Hmm.
It was set up really nice. I mean, it was comfortable. There wasn't a lot of room to move around, but you didn't need to. All you really had to do was be able to turn your shoulders. So I
Yeah.
think just from that setup, it was pretty good. Now there were some things that weren't great.
Hmm.
To get to your chaff and flares, there's a big fat black button on the side of the canopy,
Hmm.
or just below the canopy. And sometimes when you're looking over your right shoulder trying to find that
Huh.
button, that could be a little bit problematic. Or if you wanted to switch from chaff to flares,
Hmm.
you had to reach down and physically move a switch, and you had to
Yeah.
see it because there were several switches that were the same.
Yeah.
Um, the and then switching your tape from looking at your radar to looking at your HUD, well, that was another heads down switch move you had to make.
Okay.
So that wasn't ideal as well. But once you got into the fight, other than the chaff and flares, ECM pod was a little bit problematic too because that control was blind as well. So there were a few things in the early A models that weren't set up great, but I would say overall the cockpit was comfortable, easy to see, all that kind of stuff. Now we did have the A models had a narrower combining glass for the HUD. The
Hmm.
C models had a bigger heads up display.
Okay.
So that was something to get used to. But other than that, we didn't have any digital instruments. Everything was basically 6-pack and round dials.
Hmm.
So, but that's how you grew up. So it wasn't that big of a deal.
Yeah.
But I think overall the airplane was ergonomically, with a few exceptions, set up pretty well. Somebody thought through it this
Thought
time.
through it. Yeah. Instead of just sort of
Just
scabbing,
yakking a bunch
scabbing
of
on
crap.
more and more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the setup was pretty reasonable.
Okay. Not really ergonomics, but I've heard from some Navy pilots, for example, who would go fly the F-16 relatively low hours, that because of the computer control and the stability, you were talked about landing and flying the angle of approach, that if you weren't used to that type of flight system, you could get into some pilot induced oscillation as you tried to flare and then turn down on the runway.
Yeah.
Or is that just something as an F-16 pilot was so?
I think it's just a problem with Navy pilots. No, it was there.
Yeah.
We did have some instances where maybe you got a little bit of wake turbulence from the guy in front of you or something like that, and if
Mhm.
you over controlled a little bit, which the airplane would let you do,
Yeah.
you could start scraping stuff.
Okay.
And it happened a few times, but I think for the most part, the airplane was pretty easy. It was pretty good in a crosswind. And if you just flew the procedure and flew the angle of attack, you got fairly consistent with your touchdowns and keeping all the pieces and parts on the airplane.
Yeah. which is always sort of a plus, right? When you want
It
to
is.
get
Yeah.
some cycle time on missions. Well, all right. Well, shots fired here from Air Force to Navy, but that's okay because we've had them go back the other way. I went to the staff college guy, had an F-16 pilot in my small group who, he doesn't know I'm talking about this, so I won't name a name, but he said, yeah, whatever, land on a carrier, come talk to me about a crosswind. So,
Yeah. That's right. On a carrier, you generally don't have a crosswind.
That's right.
So, yeah, but the airplane, it wasn't the easiest airplane I've ever flown, but it's up there pretty high.
Okay. And would you say, and we'll talk about tactics in the next episode, but would you say it was an easy plane, or at least maybe not an easy plane to fight well, but an easy plane to learn to fight well?
Well, you had so much capability at your fingertips. So I think especially early A models, G-lock was a significant issue. So
Right.
you could put yourself to sleep pretty easily. So that was always something that you had to think about. But in terms of learning to fight the airplane, yeah, it was really more about learning the other guy's capability. So as we spoke earlier about getting into his weak spot, because the airplane would do it. And the other big advantage of the airplane from a tactical perspective is its head-on visual cross section was pretty small.
Right.
So a clean F-16 head-on has a 1 square meter visual cross section.
Yeah.
So try to pick up 1 square meter at 5 miles.
Yeah. So
it's pretty hard to do.
Really, really off the wall question. How does that compare to a MiG-21? Do you happen to know?
Well, yeah, I've fought against MiG-21s in training.
Yeah.
MiG-21's pretty tiny, but it
just visually, like it.
Visually, it's pretty tiny. So I'd say it's probably a little bit smaller.
Okay.
But it's about the same.
Okay.
It's about the same. So their whole tactic was to make you lose sight.
Right.
So you get to the merge with the MiG-21, the first thing he's going to try and do is, go straight up or straight down and try to make you lose sight, because that's the only way he's going to win.
Right. Yeah.
It doesn't matter. I've seen guys on an offensive perch in a MiG-21, and you go fights on, you start your turn, he goes straight up.
Yeah, just to lose
try
sight.
To make sight.
I asked because I did a joint exercise in Croatia, and so we're in close to land in what in Norway would be called sort of a fjord, right? And they had MiG-21s coming over these ridge lines at us. So that's, not being a fighter pilot, what reference do I have? And I just remember if they didn't manage their engine state, right, and we could pick up the smoke as they came over the top of the ridge, we could see them. But they were green and brown, and if they popped over that ridge, you did, and that was just their closure, right? That's not even closure of me doing 300, 400, 500 knots. They were just not even visible. And I mean, they were. I will say this: they were good. They were streaking over our bows below the level of the bridge, and it was just so hard to see. I can't even imagine trying to pick that up. But to the point of this, that's one of the benefits of the F-16, right? Turbofan, small cross section, lose sight, lose the fight. Yeah. Yeah.
So they are difficult to see. So the thing you don't want to do coming to the merge is start to show any plan form, right?
Yeah.
Because you're basically trying to stay skinny and hopefully get a visual advantage coming into the merge.
Right. And would that also translate to not tipping your hand as to what you're going to do?
Well, yeah, to a degree. I mean, Tomcats were always the easiest ones because their radar had a huge Doppler notch hole in it.
Mm-hmm.
So we drive into about 8 miles, and you can see they got you lit up. They're getting ready to shoot an AIM-7 at you. And about 8 miles, you take the thing 90 degrees off. You go into their Doppler notch. They can't see you. And once the raw signal goes away, so they don't have a lock on you anymore, then you just turn and point at them and stay skinny, and you're at the merge basically unseen most of the time.
Yeah, and you're going to see a Tomcat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tomcat or an F-15, they're the size of tennis courts. So.
Yeah. Hey, Tomcat friends, I love you, but it is what it is.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, have we missed anything on what an F-16 early model was, or the flight characteristics, or the engines, or this ergonomics?
I don't think so, but I will give you one little anecdote.
Yeah, please do. Love them.
just to illustrate the maneuverability of the airplane. So, I'm 23 years old, pretty full of myself. I'm an
Mhm.
F-16 pilot, right? So I must
Right.
be pretty special. So I get to RTU, and my first flight in a B model, and I had a Belgian IP in the back.
Mhm.
So we go out. It's kind of a basic fam flight, right? You do loops to music and just getting used to the airplane. We come back up initial, and I'm thinking I'm going to impress this guy, right? So come up initial, I roll that thing up, and I pull as hard as I can coming around the corner, and he's in the back laughing. I mean, hysterically laughing, and I'm trying to figure out what's so funny because I'm showing him what a man I am, right?
Yeah.
I roll out, I can't see the runway because I've turned right up my own butthole, and I'm back over the runway.
Yeah.
So that airplane the turn on that airplane and that was at 300 knots.
Yeah.
So the turn on that airplane is pretty impressive. And so you can't just go ripping around the sky. You got to know where you want to put it.
Right.
So the thing was super maneuverable to the point where the cocky 23-year-old kind of got to eat a little bit of crow there because now I can't land the airplane because I'm right over the runway going the wrong way.
Enough karate to kick your own ass in that case.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, I guess one last question before we go till next time. Hilts, is that straight from the name, or do we have some Steve McQueen throwback there?
No, well, there's a little probably. It's straight from the name.
Okay.
But people make that reference as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's just, I never screwed up bad enough to get a more interesting call sign.
Fair. All right, and that alone is a testament to a career, right?
It's a minor miracle. Yeah.
Yeah. Fair enough. All right, Hilts, thank you for your time, and everyone, we will be back soon with the next part of the early F-16s.
All right, looking forward to the next one.
I am too.